At 50 years old, Marlon Hayes believed he understood the architecture of his life. He was a senior powertrain engineer for Stellantis, a position he'd held in various forms for over 2 decades. His salary, a respectable $185,000 a year, afforded a life of comfortable stability in the heart of Detroit. It was a good life, a solid one, built on the principles of hard work and quiet integrity that his parents had instilled in him. The foundation of this life was his home, a magnificent 1917 Boston Edison Victorian that he had purchased years before he'd even met his wife, Tatum. It was his sanctuary, a sprawling brick testament to a bygone era of craftsmanship filled with the ghosts of automotive pioneers. Tonight, the grand old house was alive, thrumming with the energy of 80 people who had come to celebrate his half-century mark. The air in the grand foyer, with its original quarter-sawn oak paneling, was thick with the scent of lilies and the expensive perfume of guests. Laughter echoed up the grand staircase. Marlon, a tall, solidly built black man with deep brown skin that seemed to absorb the soft light of the crystal chandeliers, moved through the crowd with a gentle smile. His suit was a classic, a well-tailored but unassuming $900 Hart-Schaffner Marx, a stark contrast to the flashier labels favored by some of the guests his wife had invited. He felt a quiet sense of pride, not in the party itself, the planning of which had been entirely commandeered by Tatum and her mother Karen, but in the gathering of faces. There were his colleagues from the Stellantis Technology Center in Auburn Hills, brilliant minds who spoke in the complex language of torque and thermal dynamics. There were his old friends from the neighborhood, men he'd known since childhood. And then there were Tatum's friends, a flock of brightly colored birds whose chatter revolved around vacation homes in Charlevoix and the latest acquisitions from the Somerset collection. He had no idea what was coming. He believed this night was a testament to a life well built, a marriage that, while not perfect, was secure. He thought the tension he sometimes felt, the subtle current of dissatisfaction from Tatum, was just the normal friction of 2 different worlds colliding. His world was one of tangible things, engine blocks, patent applications, the satisfying heft of a wrench in his hand. Hers was a world of appearances, of social status, and the constant, hungry pursuit of more. He thought they had found a balance. He was profoundly wrong. The evening wore on, a seamless production orchestrated by Karen, who glided through the rooms like a proprietary shark. At precisely 9:02 p.m., as dessert was being served, a decadent, multi-layered Black Forest cake from a premium Birmingham bakery that had cost a staggering $400. Karen tapped a delicate, long-nailed finger against her champagne flute. The room quieted. "If I could have everyone's attention," Karen said, her voice smooth and practiced, "my daughter Tatum would like to say a few words in honor of our birthday boy." A warm, expectant applause filled the room. Marlon smiled at his wife. Tatum stood, and she was a vision. She wore a shimmering off-white Roland Mouret gown that had set them back $3,500, a purchase she justified as an essential investment for networking. She held her champagne flute, not with the cheerful air of a toast, but with the grim finality of a gavel. The smile on her face didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, Mother," she began, her voice cutting through the expectant hush. 50 years, it's a milestone, a time for reflection, a time to take stock of one's life and decide if the path you're on is the one you truly want. Marlon's smile faltered slightly. The tone was odd, not celebratory. He glanced at Karen, who was watching her daughter with an expression of intense, almost predatory pride. "Marlon and I have been married for 12 years, Tatum continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing on him. It was a cold, impersonal stare. And in that time, I've supported his career, his hobbies, his quiet ambitions. A few of her friends tittered knowingly. The word quiet was laced with something that sounded like pity. I hosted dinners. I decorated this big, drafty house. I played the part of the dutiful wife to a man who was content with enough. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. Marlon felt a prickling on his skin. This wasn't a toast. This was a performance, an indictment. "But I am not content with enough," Tatum declared, her voice rising. "I want a life of passion, of excitement, a life without limits. So I'm not here to toast to Marlon's past 50 years. I'm here to toast to my future." She raised her glass higher, a toast to my freedom, to my new chapter which begins tonight. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Marlon felt his heart slam against his ribs. He watched, as if in slow motion, as she reached into her small, beaded clutch and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. "Marlon," she said, her voice now flat and devoid of any emotion, "I'm divorcing you." As she spoke those words, a man in a nondescript gray suit stepped out from near the doorway, a ghost who had been waiting in the wings. He walked directly toward Marlon. But before the man could reach him, another sound sliced through the horrified silence. A single, sharp, deliberate clap. It came from Karen. She was still standing, her face a mask of triumphant glee, her hands coming together in one crisp, shocking report of applause for her daughter's brutal act. The sound echoed in the cavernous room. It was the sound of a starting pistol for a race Marlon hadn't known he was in. The process server reached him, extended the papers, and said, "You've been served." Marlon took the documents. The paper felt cold and alien in his hand. He looked from the papers to Tatum's unyielding face, then to Karen's smug smile. He saw it all then, the years of subtle condescension, the quiet dismissals, the hunger for a life she believed he could never provide. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. This was a meticulously planned public execution. And as the weight of that betrayal settled upon him, he had a choice. He could shatter, he could rage, or he could do what an engineer does when faced with catastrophic failure: analyze the data, remain calm, and execute a precise, calculated response. He made his choice. The foundation of their disconnect was built on a fundamental miscalculation, a willful ignorance of who Marlon truly was. To Tatum and Karen, he was just a man who worked on cars. They saw the grease that sometimes clung stubbornly under his fingernails, not the complex schematics that lived inside his head. They saw his 10-year-old Chrysler 300S, a car he maintained with loving precision, and deemed it a sad, practical vehicle, not a symbol of his professional pride. They saw his $185,000 salary as a respectable but ultimately limiting middle-class ceiling. They had no concept of the world of intellectual property, of the silent, lucrative power of a well-designed patent. He remembered bringing Tatum to the Boston Edison house for the first time, 2 years before their wedding. He had just closed on it, pouring a significant portion of his early savings into the $450,000 purchase price. He was buzzing with excitement, eager to show her the grand staircase, the leaded glass windows, the Pewabic tile fireplace. "What do you think?" he'd asked, his voice echoing in the vast, empty living room. She'd wrapped her arms around herself, pulling her $800 cashmere sweater tighter. "It's big," she said, her nose wrinkling slightly. "And old? It smells like a library. Think of the heating bills." "It's going to be a money pit, Marlon." He had laughed it off. "It's an investment. It's history." Now, that same house was worth over $1.5 million, a fact she seemed to conveniently ignore, whenever she complained about its drafts. To her, it wasn't an asset. It was a dusty, inconvenient stage for the life she wanted, not the one she had. Their domestic life was a series of these quiet, painful contrasts. He would spend a Saturday happily refinishing the original hardwood floors in the study. A labor of love that saved them thousands in contractor fees. Tatum would walk in, stepping carefully around his supplies, and say, "Can you be done soon? The Winstons are having a garden party, and I don't want to show up smelling like wood stain." The Winstons, whose garden was a patch of professionally installed sod behind their $900,000 new build in Novi, were the kind of people whose approval Tatum craved. Karen was even more direct in her dismissiveness. Early in the marriage, they'd had dinner at her sprawling, sterile home in Sterling Heights, a house filled with white leather furniture and abstract art that all looked like it had been purchased from the same catalog. Over a catered meal that probably cost more than Marlon's monthly car payment, Karen had leaned forward conspiratorially. "So, Marlon, tell me again what it is you do," she'd said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Tatum says you work for Chrysler, but it's all so technical. You just tinker with car parts all day?" Marlon had tried to explain the intricacies of powertrain systems, the challenge of balancing fuel efficiency with performance, the years of research that went into a single component. Her eyes had glazed over. "Well," she'd sighed, taking a delicate sip of her $90 Chardonnay, "as long as it pays the bills, it's just a shame you don't have more ambition. A man like you, in a house like that, you could be someone if you just applied yourself to something more lucrative. Real estate, maybe. Like Tatum's father." Tatum's father, who had made a fortune in commercial real estate, had left Karen with a portfolio that ensured she would never have to work a day in her life. It was the standard against which Marlon was constantly and unfavorably measured. Their condescension was a constant, low-grade hum in the background of his marriage. It was there in the gifts they gave him. A $150 tie for Christmas, while Tatum celebrated the $5,000 Cartier watch she'd bought herself as a well-deserved treat. It was there in the way they talked about his family, good, honest people who had worked at the Ford Rouge plant, as if they were relics from a simpler, less sophisticated time. The most telling detail was their complete lack of curiosity. In 12 years, neither Tatum nor her mother had ever asked a single specific question about the 4 major patents filed under his name. They knew he'd received some awards from Stellantis, plaques that gathered dust on a shelf in his home office. They'd attended the ceremonies, smiling for the cameras, treating them like a quaint corporate ritual, like a company picnic. They never asked what the patents were for. They never asked about the licensing agreements that Stellantis had with other global automakers for his designs. They never wondered why he flew to Germany and Japan twice a year, assuming it was just more boring engineer stuff. They saw a man in a $150 tie and a 10-year-old car, living in a house he couldn't possibly afford to furnish to their standards. They heard a salary of $185,000 a year, and did their cold, simple math. They concluded that half of his modest assets, plus the house they mistakenly believed was marital property, would be a comfortable stepping stone for Tatum's glorious new life. They had built their entire plan on a foundation of blissful, arrogant ignorance, and that miscalculation, Marlon knew as he stood in his living room holding the cold divorce papers, was a fatal engineering flaw. It was a structural weakness that was about to cause a complete and catastrophic system collapse. The moments after the process server placed the papers in Marlon's hands stretched into an eternity. The 80 guests in his home were frozen, a tableau of shock and discomfort. Forks were suspended over plates of half-eaten cake. Conversations had died mid-syllable. The only sounds were the faint hum of the air conditioning and the ringing in Marlon's own ears. He looked at the document. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Tatum's name was at the top, followed by his own. It was real. He looked up at Tatum. She stood there, chin held high, a Joan of Arc of her own imagined martyrdom. Her eyes were cold, daring him to make a scene, to yell, to give her the drama she clearly craved. He looked at Karen, whose smug smile had softened into a look of triumphant satisfaction. She was beaming, as if her daughter had just won an Olympic medal. This was their victory lap. Marlon's mind, trained to find order in chaos, began to work. He cataloged the faces in the room. His friends from work, their expressions a mixture of horror and sympathy. His neighborhood friends looking at him with deep concern. And Tatum's friends, their eyes wide, not with sympathy for him, but with a kind of thrilled, vicarious excitement. They were witnessing the social event of the season. He could almost see them composing the text messages they would send the second they got to their cars. He felt a surge of white-hot anger, a primal desire to roar, to overturn the dessert table, to expose Tatum and Karen for the shallow, cruel conspirators they were. He wanted to scream, "You have no idea what you've just done. You have no idea who you're dealing with." But then, another part of him took over. The engineer, the strategist, the part of him that understood that the most powerful response was not heat, but pressure, not noise, but silence. An emotional outburst was exactly what they expected. It would validate their narrative of him as a simple, unsophisticated man, ruled by base emotions. It would make them the victims of his predictable rage. He would not give them that satisfaction. He let out a slow, deliberate breath. He folded the divorce papers neatly in half and tucked them into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Then he turned his attention to the slice of Black Forest cake sitting on the small plate in front of him. It was a beautiful thing, with delicate chocolate shavings and perfect dollops of whipped cream. He had been looking forward to it. He picked up his dessert fork. The small silver utensil felt solid and real in his hand. He cut a small piece of the cake, making sure to get a bit of cherry, a bit of cream, a bit of the rich chocolate sponge. He lifted the fork to his mouth and took a bite. The flavors exploded on his tongue. It was, he noted, with a strange sense of detachment, an exceptionally good cake. He chewed slowly, swallowed, and took a small sip of water. Then he looked directly at Tatum, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Tatum," he said, his voice perfectly even. It carried across the silent room. "For the toast?" He then turned to the stunned crowd. "And thank you all for coming to celebrate with me tonight. Please don't let this interruption spoil a perfectly good dessert." He took another calm, deliberate bite of his cake. The effect was electric. It was so far from the reaction anyone expected that it short-circuited the entire drama. Tatum's triumphant posture faltered. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. This wasn't in the script. He was supposed to be yelling, crying, pleading. He was supposed to be a wreck. Instead, he was eating cake. Karen's smile tightened at the edges. She looked from Marlon to her daughter, a silent, urgent command in her eyes. Do something. But there was nothing to do. Marlon had refused to play his part. He had absorbed their cannonball volley with the quiet indifference of a mountain. The spell was broken. A few people started talking in low, urgent whispers. Others began to make their excuses. "It's getting late," someone murmured. "We should really be going." The exodus was swift and awkward. No one made eye contact with Tatum or Karen. They offered quiet, sympathetic nods to Marlon as they fled. "Happy birthday, Marlon," one of his colleagues said, clapping him gently on the shoulder. "Call me tomorrow." Within 20 minutes, the house was empty, save for him, Tatum, and Karen. The caterers, with professional discretion, cleared the remnants of the party, their movements quiet and efficient. Tatum finally broke the silence. "Is that it?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "That's all you have to say? You just eat cake?" Marlon finished his last bite, placing his fork neatly on the plate. He stood up. "The papers say I have 20 days to respond," he said calmly. "I will respond in due course. You and your mother should probably leave. It's been a long night." "You can't be serious," Karen sputtered, her face flushed with anger. "After all we've done for you? This is the thanks we get?" Marlon looked at his mother-in-law, the woman who had clapped at his public humiliation. For the first time, he didn't see a formidable matriarch. He saw a small, bitter woman, terrified of losing her grip on her daughter. "I think you've done quite enough," he said, the words as cold and sharp as ice. He walked past them, up the grand staircase to his office, the one place in the house that was entirely his. He closed the heavy oak door behind him, the click of the latch echoing the finality of the evening. He didn't lock it. He didn't have to. He knew they wouldn't follow. He sat down in his worn leather chair, the one that faced the window overlooking the dark, quiet street. He didn't turn on the light. He simply sat there in the darkness, the folded divorce papers a hard rectangle against his chest, and began to plan. The humiliation was the catalyst. Now came the engineering. Sunday was a day of strategic silence. Marlon woke at his usual time, 6 a.m., the morning light filtering through the tall, leaded glass windows of his bedroom. The other side of the king-sized bed was empty and cold. He saw Tatum's indentation on the pillow, a ghost of their shared life. For a moment, a wave of profound sadness washed over him. 12 years? It wasn't all bad. There had been laughter, moments of tenderness, a shared history. But it was a history built on a lie. Her lie about who he was, and perhaps his own lie that their differences didn't matter. He pushed the feeling down. Grief was a luxury he could not afford right now. Emotion was a variable that would compromise the integrity of the system he was about to build. He put on his running shoes and a simple gray tracksuit. He ran his usual 5-mile loop through the historic Boston Edison district, his feet pounding a steady rhythm on the pavement. He passed the sprawling homes of Henry Ford and James Couzens, monuments to Detroit's golden age. The crisp morning air cleared his head. He wasn't just running. He was thinking, processing, arranging the pieces of his counter-strategy. He was a man playing dumb, feigning normalcy while his mind operated at a furious pace. When he returned to the house, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Tatum. 10:15 a.m. My lawyer says you have 20 days to respond. Don't make this difficult, Marlon. It will only cost you more in the end. He read the message and felt nothing. The threat was so laughably misinformed, cost me more. The irony was a bitter pill. He placed the phone face down on the granite countertop in the kitchen. He would not respond. His silence was now a weapon. He spent the morning methodically tidying the house. He gathered the stray champagne flutes the caterers had missed. He found a single, forgotten canapé under a cushion of the sofa. He worked with a quiet, focused energy, erasing the last traces of the party, of the life that had ended just hours before. Each tidy room, each polished surface, was an act of reclaiming his space. This was his house. It had been his before her, and it would be his after. At noon, Karen called. He saw her name flash on the screen and let it go to voicemail. He knew what she would say. It would be a stream of self-righteous indignation, a lecture on his lack of gratitude. He didn't need to hear it. He made himself a simple lunch, 2 eggs scrambled with a piece of toast. As he ate at the kitchen island, he made a list on a yellow legal pad. 1, attorney. 2, house deed premarital. 3. Retirement account statements. 4. 01k plus IRA. 4. Patent agreements. Folder 7-B. 5. Royalty statements. Last 5 years. He knew exactly where each item was. His life was compartmentalized and organized, a habit from decades of managing complex engineering projects. His personal finances were no different. Folder 7B was in the locked bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in his office. It contained the documents that would dismantle Tatum and Karen's entire plan. Later that afternoon, Tatum called. He had a feeling she would, her impatience getting the better of her. He decided to answer. He needed to maintain the facade of the stunned, wounded husband for just a little longer. "Hello?" he said, his voice quiet, deliberately subdued. "Marlon?" "Finally," she said, her voice sharp, impatient. "Why haven't you been answering?" "I've been processing," he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "Well, you can process later," she snapped. "We need to talk about the logistics. I'll have movers come on Wednesday to get my things. And my mother's things. The china, the silver, the paintings in the living room." "The paintings are part of the house, Tatum," he said softly. "Don't be ridiculous. My mother bought those for us. They're ours." He didn't argue. There was no point. "Okay," he said. There was a pause. He could hear Karen whispering in the background. "Ask him about the accounts." "About our finances," Tatum said, her voice taking on a formal, rehearsed quality. "My lawyer has advised me that all assets acquired during the marriage are to be split 50-50. That includes your pension, the 401k, and the equity in the house. The house was purchased before we were married," he stated simply. "It doesn't matter," she shot back. "We lived here for 12 years. I decorated it. I improved it. It's marital property. My lawyer is very clear on that." Her lawyer, he thought, was in for a rude awakening. "Okay, Tatum," he repeated, his voice calm. He was giving her nothing to fight against, no emotional handhold. His placidity was maddening her. "Is that all you can say? Okay?" she demanded. "Don't you have anything to say for yourself? Aren't you even going to fight for me?" The audacity of the question, after the public spectacle she had orchestrated, was breathtaking. For a fleeting second, he wanted to unleash the fury that was coiled inside him, but he held it back. The time for that would come, but it would be in a courtroom, on paper, in undeniable black and white. "I'll have my lawyer contact your lawyer," he said, the words feeling like a lifetime away from the man he was on Friday. "Fine," she spat. "Be that way. You'll regret it." She hung up. Marlon stood in the silent kitchen. He had played his part, the stunned, passive husband. They had no idea that the gears were already turning. They believed they were in control, executing a flawless plan. They were celebrating their victory while he was quietly drafting the blueprints for their total defeat. He looked at his list again. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Monday morning arrived with the gray, businesslike light of a Detroit dawn. At 7:30 a.m., Marlon was already in his home office. He wore a crisp, dark navy suit, the $1,200 Canali he reserved for important meetings. He opened the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, the one that required a key, and retrieved folder 7B. He also pulled the thick file containing the original deed and title insurance for his house, dated 2 full years before his wedding date. Finally, he printed the last 60 months of statements from his personal retirement accounts, which he had never merged with Tatum's. The stack of paper was nearly 3 inches thick. It was a fortress of financial independence he had built, brick by brick, over his entire adult life. His appointment was at 9 a.m. in the Renaissance Center, in the gleaming glass towers that symbolized Detroit's resilience. He had made the call on Saturday afternoon, just hours after the party, to a number he had saved years ago, on the advice of a senior colleague. "If you ever need a shark," his colleague had said, "a real one, you call Elizabeth Warren. Not the senator," he'd added with a chuckle. "The attorney. She's the best." The offices of Warren and Associates were on the 52nd floor, offering a panoramic view of the Detroit River and Windsor, Canada, beyond. The space was modern, minimalist, and radiated an aura of expensive, lethal competence. Elizabeth Warren herself was a formidable presence. A sharp, impeccably dressed black woman in her late 50s, she had a reputation for being surgically precise in her legal strategies. Her hourly rate was a staggering $1,200, a number that would have made Tatum and Karen gasp. Marlon sat across from her at a vast glass conference table. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or emotional recounting. He simply stated the facts of the party, the public serving, and Karen's applause. Elizabeth listened without interruption, her expression neutral. "Public humiliation," she noted, jotting a single line on a notepad, "indicates a high degree of animosity and, potentially, poor judgment. A gift from a legal perspective. What are their demands?" 50% of everything," Marlon said. "They believe the house is marital property. They believe my income is limited to my salary. They are uninformed." He slid the thick stack of documents across the glass table. "Let's start with the premarital assets." He walked her through it piece by piece. First, the deed to the Boston Edison house. "Purchased and paid for in full before the marriage," he said. "The title is solely in my name." Elizabeth examined the document, her eyes scanning it quickly. "Ironclad," she murmured. "We'll need to account for any marital funds used for significant capital improvements, but the property itself is separate. What's next?" "My retirement accounts," Marlon said, pushing forward the stack of statements. "A 401k from my 28 years at Stellantis, and a separate IRA, never commingled. The total value is approximately $2.1 million. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Impressive. Most people aren't this disciplined." "My father worked the line at Ford for 40 years, Marlon said simply. "He taught me to save for a storm, even on a sunny day." "Wise man," she said. "And now for the part you mentioned on the phone. The part they don't know about." Marlon took a deep breath. This was the heart of it all. He opened folder 7B. "I hold 4 key patents related to adaptive powertrain technology," he began. "They were developed over the last 15 years. The first one was granted before the marriage, the subsequent 3 during. However," he pulled out another document. "The intellectual property agreement I signed with Stellantis upon my hiring predates the marriage. It stipulates that all inventions and patents are my sole and separate property, with the company holding exclusive licensing rights in exchange for a royalty percentage." He then slid the final, most important documents across the table. The royalty statements from the International Licensing Division. They were dense with figures, showing payments from automakers across Europe and Asia. Elizabeth picked up the top sheet. She was silent for a long time, her eyes moving back and forth over the columns of numbers. Marlon watched her professional composure, the mask of the high-powered attorney, slowly dissolve into one of genuine astonishment. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice a low whisper, "these statements, are these annual totals?" "No, ma'am," Marlon said. "Those are quarterly." She looked back down at the paper, doing the math in her head. Her lips formed a silent word. "Wow." "The annual total from the 4 patents," Marlon supplied, his voice steady, "averages approximately $3.2 million a year, after taxes." Elizabeth Warren leaned back in her expensive leather chair. She looked at Marlon, then at the mountain of evidence on her desk, and then out the window at the city of Detroit sprawling below. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a shark that had just scented blood in the water. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice now filled with a new energy, a predatory thrill. "Your wife and her mother have made a critical, multi-million-dollar error in judgment. They staged a public execution, assuming they were dealing with a sheep. They are about to find out they've tried to corner a wolf." She leaned forward, all business once more. "Here is what we are going to do. We will file a counter-petition immediately. We will accept the divorce. We will not contest it in any way. However, our petition will include a full and transparent declaration of assets, clearly delineating separate and marital property. We will attach every single one of these documents as exhibits. Exhibit A, the deed. Exhibit B, the retirement accounts. And Exhibit C, the patent agreements and royalty statements. We will not ask for anything," she continued. "We will simply lay out the facts. The truth, in this case, is more devastating than any legal maneuvering we could ever attempt. We will serve it to her and her attorney by tomorrow afternoon. And then," she paused, a glint in her eye, "we will wait for the phone to ring." Marlon felt a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. This was not revenge. This was an equation being solved. It was justice, delivered with the quiet, irrefutable logic of a mathematical proof. The strike was executed with the precision of a military operation. On Tuesday afternoon at 2:17 p.m., a process server, a different one from the party, arrived at Karen's residence in Sterling Heights. Tatum was there, as Marlon knew she would be. She had moved in with her mother the night of the party, setting up a command center for her new life in the guest bedroom. From an omniscient perch, one could see the scene unfold. Tatum and Karen were in the stark white living room, celebrating. They had just gotten off the phone with Tatum's lawyer, a man named Rick, who specialized in contentious divorces for the wives of moderately successful businessmen. He had assured them their case was a slam dunk. "He owns the house, so we get the house," Rick had said, his voice slick with confidence. "His pension is on the table. We'll argue for permanent alimony based on the length of the marriage and your contribution as a homemaker. Don't you worry, Tatum. We're going to take him to the cleaners." Based on this assurance, Karen had opened a bottle of Veuve Clicquot, the $65 champagne she considered her everyday bubbly. "To your new beginning, my darling," she said, clinking her glass against Tatum's. "Free from that boring, unambitious man, you're finally going to have the life you deserve." Tatum smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile. "He was holding me back, Mom. I see that now. He had no vision. Happy with his old car and his dusty old house. He'll be living in a small apartment soon enough," Karen said with a cruel little laugh, "and you'll be deciding which of your 2 new cars to drive to the club." It was at that moment the doorbell rang. "That must be the delivery from Neiman Marcus," Tatum said, getting up. She opened the door to find a bland-looking man holding a large manila envelope. "For Tatum Hayes," he said, handing it to her. She took it, a flicker of annoyance on her face. "What is this?" she asked, expecting more legal boilerplate from her own attorney. "It's a response," the man said, and walked away. Tatum closed the door, tossing the envelope onto the $12,000 marble-topped coffee table. "More paperwork? God, I'll be glad when this is over." "Let me see," Karen said, her curiosity piqued. She picked up the thick envelope, her perfectly manicured nails tearing it open. "Let's see what pathetic defense he's trying to mount." Tatum sipped her champagne, scrolling through Instagram on her phone. She was already following luxury real estate agents in Bloomfield Hills. Karen pulled out the stack of papers. The top sheet was the counter petition. She scanned it quickly. Blah, blah, blah. Respondent Marlon Hayes agrees to the dissolution of the marriage. Well, at least he's not going to fight it. Smart man, she scoffed. He knows he'd lose. She continued to read, her brow furrowing slightly. What is all this? Declaration of assets. Exhibit A? Deed of trust, Boston Edison property. She flipped through the pages. He attached the deed. Why would he do that? Dated 2007. Wait a minute. We were married in 2009. Her voice trailed off. A small seed of doubt had been planted. What is it, Mom? Tatum asked, not looking up from her phone. Exhibit B, Karen read, her voice now a little strained. Statements for Vanguard 401k and Fidelity IRA, sole and separate property of Marlon Hayes. What is this? The total is... Her eyes widened. She squinted at the paper. 2 million? That can't be right. It must be a typo. 200,000 maybe. What are you talking about? Tatum said, finally looking up, sensing the shift in her mother's tone. His retirement, Karen said, her voice trembling slightly. It says there's over $2 million in it. Tatum snatched the papers from her mother's hand. She saw the numbers, the official letterheads from Vanguard and Fidelity. A cold dread began to creep up her spine. Where did he get this? He must have forged these. But it was Exhibit C that shattered their world. Exhibit C, Karen whispered, picking up the next section of the document, her hands shaking. Intellectual property agreements and royalty statements. Tatum began to flip through the pages. They were dense, filled with technical jargon and legal clauses. But then they got to the statements. Pages and pages of them. Line items with names of foreign car companies, followed by long strings of numbers. At the bottom of each page was a total. Tatum's eyes landed on one. A quarterly statement. Net royalty payment, $812,456.78. She stared at it, her mind unable to process the figure. It had to be a mistake, a cruel joke. She flipped to the next one. $789,102.45. And the next, $845,333.91. She dropped the papers. They scattered across the pristine white rug. Her face, which had been flushed with champagne and victory, was now the color of chalk. Karen knelt down, her joints cracking, and picked up one of the royalty statements. Her lips moved as she read the numbers aloud, her voice barely a whisper. 3.2 million a year. The reality of the situation crashed down upon them. This wasn't a man with a $185,000 salary. This was a multi-millionaire who had been living quietly among them, his wealth as invisible as the air they breathed. And they had just publicly, spectacularly thrown him away, assuming he was worthless. Tatum stumbled backward, her hand going to her mouth. The Veuve Clicquot, the symbol of her new, elevated life, suddenly seemed like cheap swill. The life she had just thrown away wasn't the one she had imagined. It was a life of unimaginable wealth, a life she had been too blind and too arrogant to see. The champagne flute, forgotten in her hand, slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the edge of the marble coffee table with a sharp crack, then shattered on the floor, the golden liquid pooling on the expensive white rug like a spreading stain. The sound of the breaking glass was the sound of her future imploding. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The first call came to Marlon's attorney, Elizabeth Warren, less than an hour after the papers were served. It was Tatum's lawyer, Rick. His slick confidence had evaporated, replaced by sputtering rage. "What is this stunt you're pulling, Elizabeth?" he yelled into the phone. "These documents are fraudulent. You can't just invent millions of dollars." Elizabeth, who had been expecting the call, put him on speakerphone for Marlon to hear. She leaned back in her chair, a picture of calm. "Rick," she said, her voice cool and level. "Are you accusing my client, a senior engineer at Stellantis, of committing federal wire fraud and forgery? Because that's a very serious allegation. I'd be careful what you put in writing." There was a pause on the other end. "He never disclosed this income," Rick stammered. "He was never asked," Elizabeth replied smoothly. "The patents are a matter of public record. The royalty agreements are with his employer, governed by a premarital contract. It seems your due diligence was, shall we say, lacking? Perhaps you were too focused on the color of the drapes in the house your client thought she was going to get." The line went silent for a beat. Then Rick cleared his throat. "This changes things. We'll need to renegotiate." "There is nothing to renegotiate," Elizabeth stated flatly. "Our position is clear. The house is his. The retirement is his. The patents are his. Your client is entitled to 50% of the marital assets, which, after we subtract her considerable credit card debt, amounts to approximately one 2018 Honda Civic and some furniture. My client is even willing to forgive the $27,000 she charged to their joint card at Saks last month as a gesture of goodwill." Another, longer silence. Marlon could almost hear Rick's mind calculating the hours he'd already spent on a case that had just gone from a slam dunk to an unwinnable pro bono nightmare. "I'll have to discuss this with my client," he said stiffly, and hung up. That evening, the first voicemail from Tatum landed on Marlon's phone. Her voice was a mixture of confusion and anger. Voicemail 1, 6:45 p.m. "Marlon, call me, now. My lawyer is talking nonsense. We need to clear this up. What is this joke you're playing?" He didn't call back. An hour later, the second one arrived. The confusion had curdled into pure fury. Voicemail 2, 7:52 p.m. "You've been lying to me for 12 years. Lying about who you are. You let me think we were just getting by while you were sitting on millions. You selfish. How could you do this to me?" The lack of self-awareness was astounding. He deleted the message. The cascade of consequences was just beginning to gather momentum. Consequence 1, the legal collapse. The following day, Rick, Tatum's lawyer, officially dropped her as a client. He sent her a certified letter citing a fundamental misrepresentation of the financial realities of the marriage and an irreparable breakdown of the attorney-client relationship. He also included a bill for $15,000 for his services to date. Mulbikimo for Sari Parne, payable immediately. Tatum, who had no income and whose credit cards were maxed out, was now legally adrift and in debt to the very man who was supposed to fund her liberation. Consequence 2, social exile. The story of the party had already spread through their social circles like wildfire. But the new information, the revelation of Marlon's secret wealth, added a shocking and delicious twist. Tatum and Karen were no longer seen as a brave woman and her supportive mother. They were recast as the architects of a greedy, failed coup. Karen's phone stopped ringing. Invitations to her bridge club and charity luncheons mysteriously dried up. The friends who had watched her clap at the party now crossed the street to avoid her. She had gambled her social standing on her daughter's divorce and lost spectacularly. Consequence 3, the financial reckoning. With no lawyer and no income, Tatum's position was untenable. The divorce proceeded exactly as Elizabeth Warren had outlined. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had read the affidavits describing the 50th birthday party, was visibly unimpressed with Tatum's behavior. The final decree was a brutal confirmation of Marlon's claims. Tatum was awarded no alimony. She had no claim to the house, the retirement funds, or the royalty income. Her share of the marital property amounted to her clothes, her jewelry, most of which wasn't paid for, and the aforementioned 2018 Honda Civic, which came with a monthly payment she could no longer afford. Consequence 4, The humiliating downward spiral. The life of luxury Tatum had envisioned evaporated. Karen, facing her own social and financial pressures, told Tatum she couldn't stay with her indefinitely. "You need to stand on your own 2 feet," she'd said, the irony apparently lost on her. Within 2 months of the party, Tatum was forced to move out of her mother's pristine Sterling Heights home. She found a small one-bedroom apartment in a dreary complex in Warren for $950 a month. To pay the rent, she had to sell the Cartier watch and several designer handbags for a fraction of their purchase price. She took the first job she could find, a receptionist at a dental office, earning $19 an hour. The woman who had dreamed of a life without limits was now scheduling root canals and reminding people to floss. The frantic, pleading voicemails continued for weeks, a soundtrack to her descent. Voicemail 3 1 week later. "Marlon, please. We can work this out. I was upset. My mother, she put ideas in my head. I didn't mean it. I still love you." Voicemail 4, 3 weeks later, crying, "I'm going to lose everything. They're going to repossess the car. I have no money. Please, can't you just help me a little? For old time's sake?" Voicemail 5, 6 weeks later, her voice flat and defeated. "I got a job. It's not what I'm used to. I saw one of your colleagues in the waiting room today. It was so embarrassing. I hope you're happy, Marlon. I hope you're happy you've destroyed my life." Marlon listened to this last message and felt a pang, not of pity, but of a kind of weary sadness. He hadn't destroyed her life. He had simply stepped out of the way and allowed her own choices to bring it down around her. The grand structure of her ambition, built on a foundation of greed and arrogance, had collapsed under its own weight. A year and a half passed. The seasons in Detroit turned, from the stark white of winter to the vibrant green of a Belle Isle summer. Marlon's life, once rocked by the earthquake of betrayal, had settled into a new, more authentic foundation. The grand Boston Edison house no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. It was filled not with the chatter of people he barely knew, but with the quiet hum of his own contentment. He had won. He had kept his house, his retirement, and the staggering income from his life's work. But victory, he discovered, was a quiet, internal affair. There was no grand celebration, no gloating. The satisfaction came not from Tatum's downfall, but from his own rise. He found a new purpose for his wealth, one that had nothing to do with designer clothes or luxury cars. Working with a financial advisor and Elizabeth Warren, he established the Hayes Stellantis STEM Scholarship Foundation. Its mission was simple: to provide full-ride college scholarships for promising students from Detroit's public schools who wanted to pursue careers in engineering and technology. His anonymous fortune was now a public ladder for the next generation. One crisp October afternoon, he stood in a conference room at the Stellantis Tech Center, the place where it had all begun. Before him stood the first 5 recipients of his scholarship. They were bright, eager teenagers, 3 young women, 2 young men, their faces alight with a mixture of awe and gratitude. They were all brilliant kids from neighborhoods not unlike the one he'd grown up in. "My father worked on an assembly line his whole life," Marlon told them, his voice thick with emotion. "He never had the chance to go to college, but he believed in the power of building things. He believed that what you create with your mind and your hands has enduring value. This scholarship is his legacy as much as it is mine." As he shook their hands, he saw the future of his city in their eyes. He saw innovation, hope, and the same quiet fire that had always driven him. This, he realized, was true wealth. It wasn't a number in a bank account. It was a force for growth, a legacy that would compound over time. His life found a new, simpler rhythm. He still drove his 2018 Chrysler 300S. its engine humming as perfectly as the day it was made. He spent his weekends driving through Belle Isle Park, the Detroit skyline gleaming across the water, or working in his garden, his hands in the rich soil. He reconnected with old friends, the ones who had been there all along, their loyalty, a quiet anchor in the storm he had weathered. One Saturday morning, he was at his favorite neighborhood coffee shop in West Village, a cozy place with exposed brick and the rich aroma of roasted beans. He was reading a book, enjoying the simple pleasure of an hour with no agenda. The bell above the door chimed, and when he glanced up, his heart gave a slight jolt. It was Tatum. He almost didn't recognize her. The polished, expensive veneer was gone. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a nondescript sweater. The exhaustion he had heard in her final voicemails was etched into the fine lines around her eyes. She looked older, smaller, and achingly ordinary. She saw him at the same moment. Her eyes widened, and for a second, he thought she would turn and flee. Instead, after a moment's hesitation, she walked toward his table. "Marlon," she said, her voice quiet. "Tatum," he replied, closing his book. Can I talk to you for a minute?" He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. She sat down, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her worn purse. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she began, her eyes fixed on the table. "Not just for the party, for everything. For the years I spent looking right through you, for not seeing who you were." Her voice cracked. "I was a fool, a greedy, arrogant fool. My mother and I, we thought we were so smart. We had it all figured out." A tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "I lost everything," she whispered, "and I deserve to. I know that now. I just wanted you to hear me say it." Marlon listened, and the last embers of his anger finally cooled to ash. He saw not the antagonist from his past, but a woman broken by her own choices, now trying to piece together a new, humbler life. He felt a sense of closure, but not a desire for reconciliation. The trust, the very foundation of what they had, was gone forever. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a $20 bill, and placed it on the table. "I hear you, Tatum," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I truly wish you peace." He stood up, leaving the money there. "Get yourself a coffee." He walked out of the coffee shop and into the bright autumn sunshine without looking back. He had forgiven her, not for her sake, but for his. Forgiveness was the final piece of engineering, the component that allowed his own life to run smoothly again, free from the friction of the past. As he drove home, the Detroit skyline rising in his rearview mirror, he thought about the nature of value. For years, Tatum and Karen had measured his worth in dollars and cents and had found him lacking. They never understood that true wealth isn't something you can spend. It's the integrity you build, the knowledge you acquire, the quiet dignity with which you live your life. It's the character that remains when everything else is stripped away. They had tried to take his house and his money, but they could never touch the real source of his power. He was a builder, and now he was finally free to build a life on his own terms, a life of authentic purpose, quiet strength, and love beyond pride.